Does a soul linger? It is a question for theologians, for philosophers, but for the physiologist, the answer is brutally simple. The brain, starved of blood but still saturated with oxygen, can fire its synapses for a time, perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps 20, a grotesque half-minute of twilight consciousness where the world, tilted on its axis, fades from a pair of unblinking eyes. In this final, silent theater of the mind, what does a queen see? Does she see the face of the man who condemned her, the infant daughter she will never see grow, or does she only register the sudden, impossible cold and the roar of a crowd that sounds for all the world like the rushing of a distant sea? For Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII of England, this horrifying possibility was merely the final punctuation mark on a sentence of torment written not in ink, but in sustained psychological cruelty. History has a habit of smoothing rough edges, of reducing complex tragedies to simple, digestible facts. We are told she was beheaded for treason on the 19th of May, 1536. A neat, tidy end to a messy affair. But this is a profound lie. Her death was not an event. It was the meticulously staged final act of a campaign designed to annihilate a woman. Not just her body, but her name, her legacy, her very place in the memory of a nation she had for a brief and dazzling moment ruled. This is not the story of an execution. It is the story of an erasure. A systematic dismantling of a human soul, so methodical, so chillingly modern in its techniques, that it resonates as a warning across the 5 centuries that separate her world from our own. To understand the horror of Anne Boleyn's end, we must look past the glint of the executioner's sword and into the profound darkness of the minds that commanded its swing. Our story begins where it ends, in the cold, damp stone of the Tower of London, but not in 1536. Let us rewind the clock by 3 short years, to 1533. The air is not thick with dread, but with the scent of coronation oils and expensive perfume. Anne Boleyn is not a prisoner, but a queen in waiting. These very walls, which will soon become her cage, are now the backdrop for her triumph. She is preparing for her coronation, the culmination of a 7-year courtship that has ripped England from the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and set the nation on a perilous new course. She walks these corridors not as a condemned woman, but as the most powerful woman in the realm. Imagine her then, vibrant, intelligent, with eyes so dark they were said to be bewitching. She had played the most dangerous game in Europe and won. She had captured the heart of a king known for his fickle affections and held it, refusing to be his mistress, demanding to be his wife and queen. This was her victory. Henry, infatuated and desperate for a legitimate male heir, had moved heaven and earth for her. He had cast off a loyal wife of 2 decades, Catherine of Aragon, and declared his own firstborn child Mary a bastard. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, all to place a crown upon Anne's head. In those heady days of 1533, the future must have seemed limitless. She was pregnant. All of England held its breath, praying for a prince who would secure the Tudor dynasty. The court buzzed with her name. Her emblem, the white falcon, was everywhere, a symbol of her soaring ambition. She was not just a consort. She was a partner in revolution, a woman of staunch, reformist faith who influenced policy and appointments. She had enemies, of course, the old guard who remained loyal to Catherine and to Rome, the common people who muttered that she was a witch, a sorceress who had enchanted their king. But with Henry's arm around her, she was untouchable. Let us invent a moment, a quiet conversation in the royal apartments at Whitehall. a few months after her coronation. The king, Henry, a giant of a man, his youthful athleticism beginning to yield to the bulk of middle age, watches her. She is reading, a reformist text forbidden just a few years prior. He might have said, his voice a low rumble, "You read dangerous things, my love." And Anne, looking up, her sharp mind always working, would have met his gaze without fear. "Truth is only dangerous to those who build their houses on lies, Your Majesty." And is my house built on lies? The question hangs in the air, a test. Our house, she would correct him, gently but firmly, is built on the rock of God's law and the promise of a son. There it is, the promise, the foundation upon which everything was built, the promise of a male heir. When she gave birth not to a prince but to a daughter, Elizabeth, the first crack appeared in that foundation. It was a disappointment, but not yet a disaster. There would be other chances. But the subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage. A stillborn son, another miscarriage. The whispers in the court grew louder. The people's curses seemed to take on the weight of prophecy. Was the marriage cursed after all? Henry's infatuation, a blazing bonfire, began to cool into the smoldering embers of resentment. His obsession with a male heir, born of dynastic insecurity and religious anxiety, became a pathological fixation. He saw God's judgment in his empty nursery. The woman he had defied the world for was now a symbol of his failure, his impotence, both as a man and as a king. And Henry Tudor was not a man who tolerated failure. His love, once a shield for Anne, was now beginning to warp into the bars of a cage. Her sharp wit, which he had once found so alluring, now sounded like nagging. Her political influence, which he had once encouraged, now felt like a challenge to his absolute authority. The hunter's eye of the king began to wander. It settled on a new face, a quieter, more placid woman from the court, Jane Seymour. She was everything Anne was not, meek, submissive, fair-haired. She promised peace, obedience, and most importantly, the potential for a son. For Anne, the game was changing. She was no longer the prize to be won, but the obstacle to be removed. The architect of her destruction would be a man of humble birth and limitless ambition, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, a blacksmith's son who had risen to become the second most powerful man in England. Cromwell was a master of law, politics, and human weakness. He was not a man driven by passion, but by cold, brutal pragmatism. He saw the king's desire to be rid of Anne not as a personal drama, but as a political problem, requiring a political solution. Divorce was impossible. It would make a mockery of the king's great struggle to marry her in the first place. Annulling the marriage would again illegitimize a child, this time Elizabeth. There was only one solution that was clean, final, and absolute: death. And so the trap was set. A conspiracy was fabricated, woven from courtly flirtations, careless words, and the tortured confessions of terrified men. The charges were breathtaking in their scope and absurdity. Adultery with 5 men, including a court musician and her own brother, George Boleyn. Incest, conspiracy to murder the king, witchcraft. It was a legal and moral blitzkrieg designed not just to convict her, but to utterly destroy her character, to paint her as a monster so depraved that her execution would be seen not as a tragedy, but as a righteous cleansing of the court. On May 2nd, 1536, the trap was sprung. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The journey was made by barge, down the same river Thames that had carried her in splendor to her coronation. This time there were no cheering crowds, but only stunned, silent onlookers. As she passed under Traitor's Gate, the reality of her situation must have crashed down upon her. This was the fortress from which few accused of treason ever emerged alive. Let us now enter the cold stone of her cell. Imagine the psychological landscape of her final 17 days. This was not a simple period of imprisonment. It was a carefully calibrated program of mental torment. Cromwell, the orchestrator, understood the human mind. He employed techniques that would be familiar to modern interrogators. First, isolation. She was separated from her friends, her supporters, and most cruelly, from her daughter, Elizabeth. Her world shrank to the size of a single room, attended only by ladies-in-waiting who were in truth spies, ordered to report every word she spoke. Then, disorientation. Her ladies were instructed to never speak to her unless spoken to, creating an atmosphere of unnerving silence punctuated by her own increasingly frantic thoughts. She was subjected to relentless questioning, often at odd hours, designed to break her spirit and confuse her mind. They would present her with the confessions of the other accused men, confessions extracted under horrific torture, or the promise of a pardon that would never come. Imagine the musician, Mark Smeaton, a young man of common birth who had caught the Queen's eye with his talent. He is in the dungeons of the Tower, a place of profound darkness and despair. Cromwell stands before him, not with a cudgel, but with a quiet, reasonable voice that is more terrifying than any threat. "Mark," Cromwell might begin, his tone almost paternal, "the king is a merciful man. He knows you were bewitched. He knows a woman of her appetites can lead a young man astray. Just tell us what she made you do. Tell us, and the king's mercy will be yours. A simple confession. A brief exile, perhaps. Far better than the rack, wouldn't you agree? Far better than feeling your limbs pulled from their sockets." Under such pressure, in the face of such pain, what is the truth? The truth becomes whatever will make the agony stop. Smeaton confessed. His confession, a desperate lie to save his own life, became the cornerstone of the case that would send 5 men and 1 queen to their deaths. Back in her chambers, Anne was forced to confront these fabricated tales of her own depravity. She would have laughed, then wept, then raged at the sheer insanity of it all. One moment she was hysterical, proclaiming her innocence to the uncaring stone walls. The next she was seized by a strange, almost manic calm. Witnesses described her as being cheerful, even joking. When the Tower's constable expressed concern that she would not have a proper block for her execution, she reportedly laughed and said, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." She would be known, she joked, as La Reine Sans Tête, the headless queen. Modern psychology has a name for this: dissociation, a defense mechanism of a mind under unbearable trauma. It is a splintering of the self, a way to float above the horror, to observe one's own destruction from a safe distance. Her gallows humor was not a sign of peace. It was the last desperate shield of a mind on the verge of shattering. And then there was the most refined cruelty of all: uncertainty. Her execution was scheduled, then postponed, then scheduled again. For a prisoner on death row, the certainty of the end provides a strange kind of comfort. To have that certainty taken away, to live in a state of suspended animation, never knowing if this sunrise will be your last, is a form of torture all its own. This was a deliberate tactic. Henry, in a final, twisted act of control over the woman he once loved, was drawing out her agony, making her dance to his tune one last time. While Anne languished, Henry was already moving on. He was celebrating. Within 24 hours of her arrest, he had Jane Seymour brought to royal apartments downstream. He sent her gifts, he wrote her poems. The brutal political calculation was laid bare.
Anne was not being executed for treason. She was being executed for failing to produce a son and for standing in the way of a woman who might. The personal had become political, and the political demanded a bloody, public sacrifice. The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned bright and clear over London. A beautiful spring day for a queen to die. Anne had not slept. Tower records show she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m, spending her final hours in desperate prayer. By the time her jailer, Sir William Kingston, came for her, she had been awake for nearly a full day, her body and mind frayed by exhaustion, stress, and terror. And now we walk with her. From her royal apartments, now a prison, through the corridors she had once walked as a queen to be. The guards who flank her are not an honor guard, but a grim escort. The courtiers who line the route, the same men and women who had once bowed and scraped before her, now watch with a calculated, fearful indifference. To show sympathy would be to invite suspicion. To show pleasure would be unseemly. And so they watch, their faces blank masks as the ghost of their queen walks past. The gallows was waiting on Tower Green. Contrary to the grand, towering platforms of Hollywood films, this one was deliberately low, barely a meter off the ground. This was not an oversight. It was a calculated detail of humiliation. It denied her the dignity of elevation, keeping her on the same level as the jeering crowd. It forced her to take only a few small steps up to her death, a mundane act for a monumental moment. And the crowd? History paints a picture of a solemn, respectful gathering. The record suggests something closer to a carnival. This was public theater, a state-sponsored spectacle. Henry's propagandists had done their work well. For weeks, the pulpits of London had thundered with condemnations of the concubine queen, the great whore. The people had been encouraged to come and witness the righteous judgment of their king. The air would have been thick with the smell of sweat, beer, and a perverse, bloodthirsty excitement. The roar of the crowd, a wall of sound designed to disorient and terrify, would have been one of the last things she heard. As she mounted the scaffold, she would have seen him. Not the king. Henry was conspicuously absent, waiting miles away at Whitehall Palace for the cannon shot that would signal her death, the signal that he was free to marry Jane Seymour. No, the man she would have seen was a stranger, an expert swordsman summoned from Calais in France. This detail is often presented as an act of mercy from Henry. The English method of execution used a heavy, clumsy axe, which often required multiple butchering blows. A sword, in the hands of an expert, promised a quick, clean death. But look deeper. It was another layer of psychological torment. It emphasized the theatrical, foreign nature of the event. It was a final indignity. After a lifetime of commanding the attention of all England, in her final moments, she would be killed by a foreigner who did not know her name, who saw her not as a queen, but as a professional challenge, a task for which she was being paid a substantial sum. This man was a symbol of how completely she had been objectified, reduced from a person to a problem to be dispatched with clinical efficiency. Tradition demanded she be allowed a final speech. This, too, was not mercy, but a required part of the performance. Her words, spoken in a clear voice that carried over the hushed crowd, are a masterclass in political survival, even at the moment of death. "Good Christian people," she began, "I am come hither to die for, as according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die." Listen to the careful phrasing. She acknowledges the law, but does not admit her guilt. She accuses no one, a final desperate act to protect her daughter Elizabeth from the king's wrath. She knew any word against Henry would seal her child's fate. She then praised the king, calling him a most gentle and sovereign lord, words that must have tasted like ash in her mouth. This was not a confession. It was not a plea for mercy. It was her final subtle act of rebellion to die a good queen, a loyal wife, and give the lie to the monstrous caricature her enemies had created. Her speech was not an act of free expression, but its absolute opposite, the ultimate censorship, where even a dying woman's words were held hostage by the power of the man who was killing her. Her ladies-in-waiting then stepped forward to remove her ermine mantle and headdress. They were weeping. She, by all accounts, remained unnaturally calm. She tucked her hair carefully into a cap, ensuring a clear path for the blade. One of her ladies handed her a blindfold. This, again, was not for her comfort to spare her the sight of the sword. It was for the executioner's benefit, to prevent her from flinching at the last moment and causing a botched, messy stroke. She knelt upright, in the French style, rather than placing her head on a block. This position required immense self-control, forcing her to remain perfectly still through sheer force of will. Witnesses reported that her lips moved continuously in prayer. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman, to distract her, reportedly called out, "Boy, where is my sword?" As she instinctively turned her head towards the sound, he drew the blade, already in his hand, and struck from the other side. It was a brutally efficient,
Cruelly deceptive act. The stroke was clean, a single swift arc. Her head was severed from her body. But the horror was not over. It was, in a way, just beginning. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, a horrifying epilogue unfolded on the scaffold. For several seconds after the head landed on the straw, the eyes continued to move. The lips continued to quiver, as if still forming the final words of her prayer. The brain, in its final, chaotic moments, was still sending signals to a body that could no longer respond. The sight was so grotesque, so profoundly unsettling, that several onlookers fainted. It was a grim biological reminder of the tenuous thread that connects body and soul, a spectacle that burned itself into the minds of all who witnessed it. The executioner then held the head aloft by its dark hair, a traditional gesture to show the crowd the sentence had been carried out. The face that had launched a reformation, the mind that had sparred with cardinals and kings, was now a bloody trophy, its eyes staring blankly out over the cheering mob. And in that moment, the campaign of erasure entered its next phase. Perhaps the most telling detail of all is what happened next. No proper coffin had been prepared. It was a deliberate, final insult. Her status as queen was so completely nullified that the basic dignity of a coffin was denied her. Her grieving, horrified ladies-in-waiting had to scramble to find a common arrow chest from the castle armory. They gently cleaned the severed head and placed it, along with her body, into the crude wooden box. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. No ceremony, no monument, no name. It was as if Henry VIII hoped that by burying her body in obscurity, he could bury her memory with it. The erasure was systematic and swift. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Her falcon emblem was chiseled from palace walls, replaced by the phoenix of Jane Seymour. Courtiers learned that to even mention her name in the king's presence was to invite his dangerous fury. History itself was being actively rewritten in real time. The official narrative, shaped by Cromwell's propagandists, was one of a merciful king forced to dispense justice upon a treacherous and immoral queen. Henry's decision to import a swordsman was recast not as theatrical cruelty, but as compassionate consideration. The horror was sanitized, the political assassination repackaged as righteous judgment. And what of the king? While his second wife's body was being unceremoniously placed in an arrow chest,
Henry was on a barge being rowed towards his new love. The cannon shot from the tower was his starting gun. The very next day he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, he was married. The callous speed of it all reveals the chilling truth. Anne's life and death were to him merely an administrative problem that had now been solved. She had failed in her primary duty to provide an heir, and so she was liquidated and replaced. The profound personal tragedy was completely subsumed by the cold logic of statecraft and dynasty. The ripple effects of this psychological trauma spread far beyond the scaffold. Her daughter, Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was immediately declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who would one day become England's greatest monarch was, in an instant, effectively orphaned and disgraced. Her mother executed as a traitor, her father publicly disavowing her legitimacy. Court records show her household was dissolved almost overnight, leaving the toddler without clothing or attendance appropriate to her former status. The punishment extended even to an innocent child, another pawn in her father's brutal dynastic game. The men executed alongside her, her own brother included, were victims of the same political machine, their lives sacrificed simply to lend credence to the unbelievable charges against the Queen. Their show trials and foregone conclusions were a chilling preview of the state-sponsored purges that would stain the history of centuries to come. For centuries, Henry's version of the story held sway. Anne Boleyn was the scheming seductress, the ambitious homewrecker who got her just desserts. But the erasure was never complete. Fragments survived, a letter here, an ambassador's report there, a line of poetry written by an admirer imprisoned in the tower who wrote of her little neck. Slowly, painstakingly, historians began to piece together a different narrative. They began to excavate her life from the rubble of Henry's propaganda. What they found was not a monster, but a woman of formidable intelligence, courage, and ambition who dared to operate in a man's world on her own terms. Her tragedy was not that she was guilty, but that she became inconvenient. She had risen too high, grown too powerful, and when her womb failed to produce the son the king demanded, her very existence became a threat to his ego and his dynasty. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, then, is not the single swift stroke of a Calais sword. It is the realization that her death was the culmination of a comprehensive, state-sanctioned campaign of character assassination, psychological torture, and historical manipulation. She was not merely killed, but was systematically unmade. Her reputation was shredded, her allies murdered, her child disinherited, her dignity stripped away, and her memory targeted for complete annihilation. When we look back at that bright May morning in 1536, we are confronted with uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the very nature of history. We see how easily a narrative can be controlled, how reality can be bent to the will of the powerful, and how a human being can be reduced to a political effigy to be built up and then ceremoniously burned. Henry VIII's most desperate attempt to erase Anne Boleyn from history ultimately failed. In his very effort to destroy her, he created a martyr and a legend, ensuring that her story would fascinate and horrify us for centuries. Her death, which he intended as an ending, became her most enduring legacy. It forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. How many other stories in our history have been similarly sanitized, their victims silenced, their complexities smoothed over to serve the agendas of the powerful? The ghost of Anne Boleyn haunts us, not just as a figure of tragedy, but as a perennial reminder that history is not a static text, but a battlefield, where the truth itself is often the first casualty. What do you believe is the most terrifying aspect of Anne's final days? The false accusations, the psychological torment in the tower, or the public spectacle of her execution? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you wish to journey with us again into the darkest corners of the past, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications.
there are countless more stories buried in the archives waiting for their truth to be told.